It's so good to see you all here. You glad to be here this morning? Man, that worship was outstanding. So good to see you all. Just a couple of things. We had some guests join us, Marcus and Claudia. I advise you not to talk to them a lot about me because I don't know, but I imagine they have some dirt on me from a past life. So stay away from them a little bit. No, good to see you guys. Good to see all of you. We are in a series in the book of Matthew. We're going to go through a whole chapter. It's been painstakingly slow to get through Sermon on the Mount. Now we're going to pick it up a little bit. And we're going to talk about something that I wish I knew more about, miracles. So what I'm going to do this morning, because there's some of you sitting here, you could bring it on this topic. And I'm going to call you out at some point and make you come up here and talk. Not today, relax. But at some point, I think it's something we ought to think about as a congregation. But what I want to do is I'm not going to read, obviously, the whole chapter. So I'm going to just go through and pick out some ideas conceptually about this, what's going on. And so we're going to pray and get started because we got a lot of things to go through this morning. So let's pray. God, I just ask for your presence to be here. Man, it's this kind of text that makes me look inside and say, I wonder if I even believe this stuff. Or maybe I think, it obviously happened, but that was for some other people in another time. But God, you know our world, and we desperately need miracles. So would you be here and open our hearts and help us fight through what we think we know. Fight through all the 101 reasons why we don't actually believe this or it might not be true for us. And leave with an excitement that you're still an amazing, amazing Jesus.
Amen. Yeah.
So speak through this text in Jesus' name, amen. So where I want to start, we've just gone through chapter 5, 6, and 7, as I said, Sermon on the Mount. There's a lot of things going on. Jesus is teaching about, really talking about the kingdom. And I remind you that all of this started when Jesus comes on the scene. He says the kingdom of heaven is near. So when he says it is near, it means it's near us. It's right here. And he's trying to help this group of people kind of believe and tap into what this actually means. And so we went through chapters 5, 6, and 7 where he does some intentional teaching, and then Matthew really pulls a surprise move. And if you were a person back in that day reading this, chapters 8 and 9, the next two chapters we're going to go through, I think there was probably a part of this would have caught you a little off guard. Because what Matthew's going to do, and so I'm just going to do a little groundwork on what he does in the next two chapters. Matthew's not talking so much and not following the life of Jesus and this kingdom idea chronologically. He's going to now bunch up in chapter 8 5 miracles, and then he's going to go to chapter 9 and do 5 more miracles. So he takes 10 miracles that were probably actually scattered over several years of Jesus' life, and he's going to bunch them up in 2 chapters. And he does that. Well, my question to you is, why would he do that? Like, why would you write that way? If you were to write the story of your life, would you bunch up parts of it in 2 chapters? Don't we kind of follow life chronologically? He doesn't do that. Now, before we go into maybe why he does it, I just want to kind of get us all on the same page. What is your definition of a miracle? Because we use that word in our time, and we kind of think about miracles. And while you're thinking about that, I just want to say that probably in our time we use the word really loosely. I drive, for those of you who don't know about me, most of you know this, but for those who don't know about me, I drive a really old, beat-up pickup. And my kids affectionately refer to it as the green latrine. That's all you need to know about it right there, right? You kind of got the picture. When Robert Weiss was on the job, if I was going to a job that he was working on, and I would pull up, Robert had this sense of awe in his face. And he would look at it, and and what he would kind of verbalize to me is, I just witnessed a miracle. That truck made it to the job. Now, all I'm going to say about that is, some of you have been asking me, why don't you get something better? It's amazingly how emotionally we get attached to pieces of junk. And I know there's therapy for that, and I've chosen not to go through therapy. My wife has begged. Anyhow, what do you call a miracle? It's not a trick question. Nice. Okay.
Grandchild saved from death.
Someone else is saying something.
As a birth of a child.
How many of you have had a miracle happen in your life? Why would Matthew go from teaching about the kingdom to help him to say, I want you to see the kingdom in action? And he starts by saying, I'm going to show you 10 miracles. I want you to see who Jesus is that way. And so he's going to go through it. Now, what I want to do is, because I have 5 miracles to go through, chapter 8, I'm just going to give you a heads up. Chapter 8, I've called Miracles of Grace. So how we're going to approach these 5 miracles. When I talk about miracles of grace, I don't want us so much to focus on what the miracle was as who the miracle was to. Because if you think about, if you were an early church person and you heard about this Jesus guy and you kind of, the rumors, because they didn't have CNN, they didn't have all these news outlets to kind of report, give you moment by moment updates on what's going on. So the word would have kind of spread, but you might have just said, what is it? Who's this guy all about? What's he all about? What's he up to and all that? But when this story, this account, if you would have got a hold of Matthew's account of it and read it, I'm telling you, when you hit chapter 8, there was so many surprises to a Jewish mind in chapter 8. They probably would have said, man, I never saw that coming. So that's one thing to think about. So chapter 8, I want to call Miracles of Grace. Chapter 9, Miracles of Mercy. Here's the difference. Here's how we're going to look at it. We don't have to look at it this way. You can spend time. You don't have to. You can spend time this week. I challenge you to spend time reading chapter 8 again and then go and read chapter 9. Miracles of Grace, I want you to look at who it happens to. That was the surprise of chapter 8. Chapter 9, Miracles of Mercy, I want to think intentionally about what were the miracles, what were they free from? Because miracles of mercy bring freedom into our life. What were they being freed from? So that's what we'll look at next week. But this week we're going to go in chapter 8. I'm going to read just a couple of verses as we go through it. So we're going to go to miracle number 1. Before we do that, I just want to have you think about this. As I thought about this whole idea of miracles, there's something inside of me I want so badly to know more about this. Because I want to know the Jesus in a deeper way behind the miracles. But I found myself having this definition for miracles: extraordinary event that happens to someone else. I hope we leave this morning knowing that he wants it to happen to you. So here we go. Large crowds followed Jesus as he came down the mountainside. Suddenly a man with leprosy approached him and knelt before him. Lord, the man said, if you are willing, you can heal me and make me clean. Jesus reached out and touched him. I'm willing, he said. be healed. And instantly the leprosy disappeared. Now, here's what I want you to know. I think most of us know this about leprosy. We kind of know how that fit into the culture. I want to remind you of it, because when Matthew starts this idea of how this kingdom stuff works out, how it works out in the power side of it, as Jesus is taking the teaching now and walking out among crowds, as Matthew starts to record that, he starts by saying there was a leper that come to Jesus. Now, to have leprosy in that day was to have a death sentence 3 ways. It was a physical death sentence because there was no known cure. So it's that guy who went before the priest because he had some spots on him, and the priest looked at him and said, "You got leprosy." That's like saying you have an incurable disease. You only have so much time and you're done. It was a physical death sentence. It was a social death sentence. I tell you, these guys were ostracized. These guys were not even allowed inside the city walls. They were pushed out. They were marginalized. They were the most unclean of all people in the country of Israel. It was a spiritual death sentence. Because the way they processed this whole idea of leprosy, the way they thought about it in that day is somewhere you had disappointed and hacked God off to the point where it was a curse from God on you. And so you were spiritually on the outside as well. And so here you have this group of people, however many there were in those days, that were pushed out. Now, I want you to process a little bit of that before we just kind of move on. See, that meant that you were separated from family. That meant you were separated from community. That meant you were never allowed to go inside the city walls to participate in any level of worship. And by the way, I found this really fascinating. This was the issue of this is the first social distancing that I know about. Do you know how far away you had to stay from a leper? Ironically, 6 feet. Jesus is going to push right through social distancing, because I tell you, the love, the power of Jesus pushes through barriers that we put up. And he walks right up to this guy that he wasn't allowed to be close to, and certainly was never allowed to touch. And he reaches out and touches him. Matthew is trying to make a point. Jesus starts when he talks about the miracles of Jesus, the power of Jesus working out in the life of people. He starts with the worst possible case there was. And he's going to, as he builds in this chapter, he's going to say this Jesus will push through barriers that we never expected him to. That's why the readers of that time would have looked at this and said, "You got to be kidding me. He's going to go out he came for lepers? You got to be kidding me." Now I want you to think about so you have the unclean part, but I want you to think about the conversation between Jesus and this man. So first of all, this guy knew the social distancing rules, and for him to come down and pursue Jesus, wow. Did you notice what he says to Jesus? If you are willing, you can heal me, you can make me clean. Now, I think in that, I like to think anyhow, in that simple statement, that leper is going 2 directions. One, God, I know, Jesus, I know you have the power. I don't doubt that for a minute. What I don't know is, did you come for people like me? Did you actually come for lepers? Did you actually come for the bottom of the social? Did you come for let's just say the bottom of the gene, all the way at the bottom? Did you come for those people? I don't doubt for a minute your power here. But Jesus, what I need to know is, at the end of the day, did you come for me? And Jesus steps through the social barrier, and he steps through all the barriers that had been erected against people like that, and he touches him and he says, I came for you. When did we stop believing that one? Because Jesus is not only, Matthew's not only trying to give us a picture of what it means to have Jesus as part of your world. He's trying to give us a picture of what it means to be the church. I think too often the church exists for people that are far too clean and we don't exist for people that like that in our culture. I need to move on. I could stay right here the rest of the morning. Let's, because I want you to see the whole picture. Second person, Roman officer. Now we're moving from the unclean to the unworthy. When Jesus returned to Capernaum, a Roman officer came and pleaded with him, "Lord, my young servant lies in bed, paralyzed and in terrible pain." Jesus said, "I will come and heal him." I'm jumping to verse 13. Then Jesus said to the Roman officer, "Go back home because you believed it has happened." And the young servant was healed that same hour. So Matthew's second case of a miracle of grace, he moves from the most unclean person in all of that culture to the second most unclean, despised person in that culture. See how he's building his case for who Jesus is, what it means to be the kingdom? He moves from the bottom to the next to the bottom. I think the people that were just caught in Jewish ways of thinking were saying, "Were you really a Roman? Not only a Roman centurion, those bad guys, those guys we'd like to run off. They're the reason we're not experiencing the freedom we want. They're the problem. They're a national problem right now." Madness speaks to us on so many levels because you pick a political side, there's someone on the other side that you're blaming for our problems right now. I guarantee you. You understand when this guy walks up and people see a Roman centurion that will approach Jesus and say, "Jesus, please, my servant is in big trouble. Do you care?" The way he speaks about it, in many ways, and there's a conversation that I can't take apart between verses 6 through 13, or 7 through 13, that happens between them. But Jesus is eventually looking at this guy saying, "Wow. You have enormous faith," because I tell you, for a Roman person to go to Jesus and say, "I need help," would be like for somebody right now who is dead set against Trump to go to Trump and say, "I need help." It doesn't happen. So Matthew moves from the most unclean to the second most unclean. He's breaking down barriers. Now he's saying Jesus has the ability in his healing power and who he is as a kingdom to fight through the barriers, the racial barriers that exist. Them people that you despise, those people, he's going to come out. He's here to touch them and to heal them and to touch their life. Third miracle. We move from the unclean to the unworthy to the unequal. Third miracle in this chapter. When Jesus arrived at Peter's house, Peter's mother-in-law was sick in bed with a high fever. But when Jesus touched her, the fever left. Then she got up and prepared a meal for him. Now, again, I think most of us kind of know the status of women in that culture. Let me just remind you of a couple of things. This is even hard to process. The men in those days had 18 prayers that they prayed. One of those prayers said this: "God, I thank you that I was not born a woman." That was their worship. Isn't prayer supposed to be worship? Who? God, I thank you that you were kind enough to me that I wasn't. And Matthew works it right into his sequence so that we understand the heart of Jesus differently. We find ourselves, if you were to look at a progression in this now, you find yourself from people who were outside the wall that Jesus is touching to someone who was allowed inside the wall. And by the way, in the whole court, in their whole worship system, there was a court of Gentiles. So now you're moving, you see this progression that's going in. I hope you're following that. Jesus is talking, or Matthew's writing, first of all, about the guys that couldn't even get inside the wall, and then he writes about the centurions who actually were allowed inside the wall into the place of worship, but they had to stay in their own little place because they were those guys, and when you're those guys, you're not allowed to be too close to the center of worship. So they had their own little court of the Gentiles. And to actually be able to move from the court of the Gentiles into actually being a person that could go closer to the center of worship, you actually had to go through these rituals and jump through all these hoops. But that's the second. We're getting a step nearer in this story. Then it was the court of women. See how Jesus is starting to break down barriers? Like he's bringing them all in, healed and ready to worship together. And so now you have the one step closer. And this lady would have been allowed into the court of worship. But there was this unequal way that they viewed ladies in those days, women in those days. And so because they were lesser, they were only allowed so close. And Matthew's first three cases of who Jesus really is in his world is he's reaching out and touching the unclean, the unworthy, and the unequal. He's breaking down physical barriers, racial barriers, and sexual barriers. That's the first three he does. Let's go to the fourth one. And now we're going to move from the outside to the inside and look at the inside. This is so fascinating. We move from the unclean, the unworthy, the unequal to the cowards. Isn't it interesting that the cowards were the ones that were on the inside? Then Jesus got into the boat and started across the lake with his disciples. Suddenly, a fierce storm struck the lake with waves breaking into the boat. But Jesus was sleeping. Did you get that? He's asleep. This God who says in the Old Testament, he never slumbers or sleep, is fast asleep in the boat with him. The disciples went and woke him up, shouting, "Lord, save us. We are going to drown." Jesus responded, "Why are you afraid? You have so little faith." Then he got up and rebuked the wind and waves, and suddenly there was a great calm. Okay, so now we moved, as I said, from the outside to the inside, and here's what we find inside. What you find is a couple of guys. So there's a few surprises. Again, if you didn't know this story and you were a Jewish first century person reading this text, there was a couple of real big surprises. The first surprise is that Jesus is asleep. Now, what isn't a surprise is that there's a vicious storm on this. It's kind of the reoccurring theme, it feels like. You get out of the Sea of Galilee, and if you're reading the Gospels and you get out in the Sea of Galilee, it's just kind of like, wonder if a storm's going to happen. And boom, there it is. So the first surprise is that somewhere in this thing, Jesus is asleep. And I just want to mention this. I'm not going to chase this far, I promise you. I really think the reason some of us quit believing is because it feels like Jesus is asleep in our case. Like, I'm right in the middle. Jesus, do you have any idea how broken my marriage is? where the heck are you? When I need a miracle, why are you asleep? Jesus, do you have any idea how broken my family is? Where are you? First surprise, Jesus is asleep. Now, I just want to comment on this, just to say this. This is a real storm, and the storm is right on him. Second surprise that would have been is the insiders, how freaked out the insiders are. These guys, these are the guys that have witnessed what? And if you think about the humorous side of this, seriously, you think the boat's actually going to go down with Jesus in it and we're all going to be done? Like this ministry is over? This movement is, that's it, right here. I think Jesus is as surprised about that as the readers would have been. And when he wakes up because they are panicked, and it's like, and he calls them people of little faith. I chase that idea down as best I can understand that. He said, it's this idea. I'm going to oversimplify it for our time this morning. So let me just oversimplify something that's a little more complex than this. But it's basically the believing that Jesus has been good for this and this and this, and it's possible that he's good for this and this, but this thing I'm in right now, no. And the idea that Jesus is telling them is your faith is literally worthless. So when he says little faith, he's not saying it in the context of mustard seed size faith that's going to grow. He's saying, man, whatever you guys, the faith that you're believing in, what you really think about me, you think I'm big enough for lepers and you think I'm big enough for centurion, but I'm not big enough for storms? Let's go to the last one, and then I'll do just a little wrap up. See why you need to read this? Boy, we need to read this week and just look at where we fit in. He's moved from the unequal or the unclean to the unworthy to the unequal to the cowards, and now he's going to move to this. I was tempted to call this something else, and I'll explain that in a minute. When Jesus arrived on the other side, so what I really wanted to call is the other siders. Is he really there for them? Why would he be there for them? The question is, are we there for them? When Jesus arrived on the other side of the lake in the region of the Gadarenes, wherever that is, two men who were possessed by demons met him. They came out of the tombs and were so violent that no one could go through the area. They began screaming at him, "Why are you interfering with us, Son of God? Have you come to torture us before God's appointed time?" There happened to be a large herd of pigs feeding in the distance. So the servants begged, "If you cast us out, send us into the herd of pigs." "All right, go," Jesus commanded them. So the demons came out of the men and entered the pigs, and the whole herd plunged down the steep hillside into the water, into the lake, and drowned in the water. There's something about this that is almost, can be, in our culture, almost unnerving. I don't know how much I want to say this morning about this, except that let me just make a couple of basic comments to start with. I want you to notice where Jesus has gone. He's crossed the lake. He's on the other side. There was this mindset about the other side people. I think we have ways of thinking that same kind of thing today. Like if a certain thing happens in a certain people group, we're like, yeah, well, here's my shock face. Don't we? You guys don't? I do. I'm going to be first up to say I'm guilty as charged. But what he's run into when he got out of the lake, which would have not been surprising to any of the disciples who were with him. They would have expected this. This is the kind of stuff you expect from people on the other side. Like some out-of-control freak that's in a cemetery running around shouting and everybody's terrified. Let me rewind the clock in my own life. I was 21 years old. I was working as a chaplain's assistant in a prison. I walked in with another one of the guys that was mentoring me, and we were in one of the one of the darkest prisons in the state of Alabama, and we walked into this one dorm. And we were going just down through, I was kind of trailing him. He was kind of just helping me think through, what is your job here? And when we got it is strange. I don't know how to describe this, so I'll just say it how I felt it. When we walked into that particular dorm room, there was something happened. It was like the whole prison felt evil, but this particular area was like. And we started down through there, and in the back of the dorm, so there was probably, I'm trying to think, there's probably, if I was to guess now, I mean, this is like a lifetime ago. 21 is a long ways in the rear mirror for those of you who are wondering. So I'm trying to bring this. I would have guessed there was probably 100 beds in that dorm. And then way at the back, as soon as we walked in, this guy cuts loose on us. He is cursing. He is shouting. He is mocking. He's doing everything possible. I'm freaked out of my mind. I'm like, the guy I'm with never misses a beat. He goes from bed to bed, and he's talking to the guys, and we walk all the way down, and when we get to the back where this guy is, and now he's got a couple of guys helping him, he kind of just moves across, and we start going forward. And when we get to the front of the dorm, all of a sudden he turned around and he pointed back at that guy and says, the proof that my Jesus is real and the person you're following isn't, you will not sleep one bit tonight. You could have heard a pin drop. He turned around and walked out. I'm walking out looking back, kind of. And when we cleared the dorm area, we had some gates to go through. When we cleared the dorm area, I looked at Arlen and I said, Arlen, you understand, if that guy even dozes, we're done. It's game over right here for us. And he just looked at me and says, don't worry, kid. My Jesus is way bigger than that. And that guy will not sleep a wink tonight. Guess who met us at the gate the next morning? There wasn't enough sleeping pills in that whole prison to put that guy to sleep. A man that was completely controlled by a force outside himself found Jesus. Is Jesus really here for them? You bet he is. Now, I want to wrap this up by doing this and then tell another story. Can you go to the next slide? I did this, and this is the way my mind works. This might be as wonky as can be. If you were to put, because we have this way of thinking that God's grace in this miraculous comes in some sense in relation to our faith. And there is a connection, and we need teaching on that. I don't doubt that. But I want you to look at this. If I was to give, this is my grading scale. Unclean leper, how great was his faith? he gets an A in my mind because he knew. He knew this. He already had 3 death sentences on him. There was only one chance of getting out of it. He gets an A. He knew where to go. The Roman officer, he gets an A. You know what? I don't know. It doesn't say anything about her faith or faith anyone else. So, what about those guys? I tell you, Jesus ripped them apart for their faith. And the last guys, they weren't even pursuing Jesus. They were trying to chase him off. Here's my point. Jesus' grace met every one of them and set them free. Because if you're sitting here this morning saying, well, the miraculous, I just struggle, I'm trying, maybe my faith. Here's what I'm challenging you. Just start moving toward Jesus. Because when you move near him, when you take that step toward him, maybe you're still struggling like you are with a cowardly faith that gets a solid D. And you'll be surprised because grace comes to those who least deserve it.
Amen.
The unclean, the unworthy, the unequal, the cowardly, and the other-siders. They found his grace.
Amen.
A couple of comments, and then I'll finish with my last story. Just give me a couple of minutes. One, here's a couple of things. I hope, I'm praying, I'm believing that we're going to leave understanding differently the eagerness of Jesus to touch your life. Did you notice his eagerness in every one of these? Even when they got a D on the faith scale, he was there for them. Man, to the people that in that culture, the way they saw it, he should have never reached. He steps through the barriers. He breaks down the barriers that had been erected. He steps beyond them and he touches. He is waiting for us to say, man, I need you, Jesus. The eagerness of Jesus. The other thing, I think one of the common things I see in this chapter, and I'm not going to comment yet on the next chapter, but I'm going to just call it this desperation of people and of the people. If you looked at every one of these cases, I don't ever want us to think of Jesus as the last resort, because that's what this feels like, right? I want us to start seeing Jesus as the only resort. And when I come to him saying, God, the brokenness in my world, the brokenness in my family, the brokenness in my marriage, the brokenness in my life, all this stuff that's going on, I know this. You're the only one that can really touch and bring and I desperately need a miracle. And then just this. Coming near to Jesus, moving toward Jesus is moving toward help, moving toward grace, moving toward hope, and moving toward power. Let me tell you about Amy. This is, again, rewinding the clock quite a few years, so I'm trying to think of all the details that happened in this event. If I remember correctly, Amy was 12 years old. She had come down with some sort of a rare disease that put her in a coma, and she found herself, her parents found their 12-year-old daughter in a coma on life support very quickly. And as teams of doctors and different physicians were called in to try to figure out what was going on, the common theme was, this is something so rare and so bizarre, they didn't have any idea. And so they were not able to, on much of a level at all, to offer much hope at all to the family, to to the parents. There was a person that I know who lived some distance away, wasn't really acquainted with Amy or the family, or he just heard about it. And God really laid it on this guy's heart to once a week just take time out of his busy schedule, because he had a crazy busy schedule. And if I remember right, it was a distance of somewhere between, if again, the way I recall it, an hour and a half to the hospital. And he would drive down there once a week, and he'd walk up into Amy's room. And on the way down, he would try to prepare his heart. God, what do you want me to pray for Amy? And then he'd go up into her room. And as the days went to weeks and the weeks went to months, eventually he became, as he showed up, eventually the nursing staff became annoyed by him being in there. And he tried to be really respectful when they came in. He would just step back. But he would, and they there was a couple of the nursing staff actually began to mock him, like, dude, seriously, don't waste your time on this girl. Like, this is, whatever you're praying for, this girl's not the one to be. Find something else. And began to almost mock him. And he kept showing up week after. And then one week, on his trip down, he was asking God, what do you want me to pray for Amy today? And a word came into his heart. And as he walked into the hospital and went up the elevator and got off on the floor, he went by the nurse's desk and he said, can you tell me what's happening with Amy? Give me an update. And he said, there's been a decrease, kind of a gradual decrease in her brain activity. And fairly quickly now, her family's going to have to decide whether to unplug her or not. Because what they had told the parents is, even if she does ever come out of her coma, she will be, because of what had happened in her brains through that time, she will be a vegetable. And he walked into her room, and that day he hardly spent any time. He walked into the room, he knelt down by the bed, Amy's bed. He took her hand in his, and he whispered in her ear this, Amy, nothing will keep us from our miracle. Nothing. And he stood up and walked out. The nursing staff said that day when he walked by them, he had tears running down his cheeks, and he was muttering to himself, nothing will keep us from our miracle. Nothing. He got on the elevator. He got in his car. A couple days later, he got a call from the parents. And they said Amy woke up. And there is 0 brain damage. And she's been completely restored and healed. People, we must become people who so deeply believe in the work of Jesus. Amen. In our hearts and in our lives and in our world, that we're the kind of people who, I don't care how many weeks it takes or how many months or how many years, we're going to be the kind of people who say, nothing is going to keep us from our miracle. Amen. Nothing. When did we quit believing in that Jesus? When did we think that was for some other time? Wouldn't he love to be doing that in our world? You know what? He is, and he's going to do a lot more, I promise. And we better get ready for it, because he wants to do it through some of us. Now, I want to wrap this up with just this. I think when we think about this, I don't want you to so much think about what grade your faith gets this morning. I want you to really focus on how amazing your Jesus is. Because we need to remind ourselves the biggest tragedy is not that I quit believing that I'm worthy of it. Because one thing this whole thing tells us about ourselves is somewhere we fit into that. It's not a matter of worthiness. Grace never is. It's not even so much about his power. We know his power is there, don't we? Or do we? Have we been in this journey of being disappointed when Jesus didn't come through for us like we thought he would? Or it didn't happen when we thought it should? And we kind of give in and quit and think, well, that's for someone else. That definition I gave you, it's the miraculous, it's an extraordinary event that happens to the people around me. It never happens to me. When we start to think that, eventually what happens is it's not only a loss of faith on our part, but it's really not believing that Jesus is who he said he is. So let's remind ourselves in the rest of this service this morning of who he is. Zach's going to come, and I think Zach's going to do a song to remind us of that. But even as he does that, here's what I want you to think about. Not only who Jesus is, but what is the miracle that you desperately need this morning? I come in here this morning, and I got a couple situations in my life, and I realized as I went through this text today that, man, there's levels in which I've actually quit believing that he's actually going to do miracles. I needed this text more than you guys did, I promise you. So what's the miracle you need? Can you reach out to him? Because he's just waiting. He is so eager to reach out to you.
Amen.
So eager. And I don't know if there's many of the prayer team. If you want to come up here and pray, I just invite you to do that if some of the prayer team. But guys, I hope you are saying to yourself, nothing's going to keep me from that miracle. Nothing. Zach, would you lead us?